Good morning, everyone. My name is Ilhan Omar. I'm the Assistant Minority Leader here in the Minnesota House. Thank you all for joining us this super early morning on International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day to you all. I am excited and delighted to be here to be introducing a piece of legislation that will eliminate the statute that will get rid of the statute of limitation for sexual violent crimes. When I first met Sarah, and Asma, who you will hear from in a little bit, a few months ago, and we started talking about what this meant for them as survivors and victims of sexual violence. We started to think about what these arbitrary limitations meant, and as we think about and move into a space in our society where more women and more victims are feeling empowered and supported, and feeling like it might be the right time to come forward with their stories and file a report. Having these kind of limitations takes away the choice for them to come forward when they feel like it is right for them. And so we want to start this process in creating the space for victims and survivors to come forward when it is right for them. And so I am excited to be doing this with many of my colleagues. This is a very bipartisan bill. And we're excited to be working in collaboration with both of the caucuses. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Sarah Super, who is with Break the Silence, who will share a little bit of her story and what this bill means to her.
My name is Sarah Super, and I'm the founder of Break the Silence. My work to end rape culture and hold perpetrators accountable began 3 years ago after an ex-boyfriend broke into my apartment and raped me at knife point. I fled my apartment screaming. The police were called. He was taken into custody, and we would move through the criminal justice system in which he would plead guilty and be sentenced to 12 years in prison. The system worked just as it should in my case. I was believed, respected, heard. My perpetrator was held accountable and given a serious sentence that matched the nature of his crime. When I publicly spoke out about my experience, I was, for many people, the first-hand account of rape they had ever heard. I defied their notions of who this happens to. I challenged their stereotypes of who commits this crime. I began to tell my story far and wide, and each time the same thing happened. By telling my story, I unconsciously gave others permission to tell theirs, and I heard story after story after story. Survivors of sexual violence surround all of us. They are our friends and family, neighbors and colleagues. But survivors have been silenced by a justice system that fails to hold the majority of perpetrators accountable. Survivors are silenced by a society that invalidates their experiences, blames them for what happened to them, or shames them, the survivor, and not the perpetrator. In addition to the injustice from the system and the suffering from the community's response, survivors face their own personal trauma. As Bessel van der Kolk wrote, trauma isn't the story of something awful that happened in the past, but the residue of imprints left behind. At the heart of trauma is disempowerment, being forced, held captive, having no choice but to endure. Choices, therefore, become an essential part of every survivor's healing. Reporting one's own experience to the police is a choice that every survivor deserves, and that they deserve to have that choice their entire lives. We know so much more now about traumatic memory that how we remember traumatic situations is far different than other memories we have. We recognize this as a pervasive human rights abuse in which 97% of the perpetrators pay no consequence for this crime. We see a society that fails to believe and support survivors. And the path of surviving is not an easy one. And though sexual violence will always be a painful experience, the response survivors receive from the justice system doesn't have to be and need not be. We can change our system for the better while honoring every person's right to due process. And one thing that we can all do starting today is to write to our representatives to voice our personal support for this bill. Eliminating the statute of limitations for criminal sexual conduct and sex trafficking is one way that we, the great state of Minnesota, can voice to survivors that we believe you, support you, stand with you, that sexual violence has no place here, and that how survivors move forward in the aftermath of this human rights abuse is always, always their choice. Thank you.
And now we will hear the Senate co-author, Senator Sandy Pappas.
Thank you, Ilhan, and thank you for asking me to author this bill with you. It's an honor. As young women, we've all had our sexual harassment experiences, from the time the assistant manager cornered you in the back room, to the uncle who rubs his leg against you in the back seat of the car, to the guy who grabbed your hand late at night at a bus stop offering you a ride home. We count ourselves lucky that we escaped sexual assault, but that's not true for thousands of young girls whose trust was betrayed, who were tricked, who were groomed, or who were forced into an unwanted, violent sexual encounter. These girls, now women, after years of therapy, of bulimia, of attempted suicide, of self-blaming and self-doubting, these girls finally deserve their day in court. Thank you.
And now we will hear from Asma Muhammad from RISE.
Hello, everyone. My name is Asma Muhammad, and I am here with Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment. I wanted to share a short story with you all today. For several years, I worked with and taught students from Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools. And during that time, I got to share my story with them. In 2016, I first shared with my students that I was a survivor. And I shared with them the guilt, the pain, the shame, and the lack of support I saw from my community. And after I was done, my students, 4 of them, all under the age of 14, came to me, boys and girls, black, brown, white, Christian, Muslim, and said, "Asma, me too." In a few years, the current statute of limitations will no longer protect them and protect their right to report. It will protect their perpetrators instead and allow them to be happy that the people that they hurt are silenced by the system. We know that this is not right. We know that perpetrators should be held accountable. And so today I call on the esteemed members of the House and the Senate to stand with survivors and to stop protecting perpetrators who hurt young boys, girls, women, men in our state. This is not a partisan issue. We all know someone who has suffered. And it's time we give survivors our voices and our choice back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Asma. And now we will hear from Caroline Palmer from MNCASA.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Caroline Palmer. I'm the Public and Legal Affairs Manager at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I wish to give my great thanks to Representative Omar and Senator Pappas and Break the Silence and RISE for bringing this very important issue here to the Capitol. We at MNCASA are extremely proud to support this measure, and we're so proud to support the survivors who are speaking up now more than ever during the Me Too movement. I want to say during this session we have seen more bills come up about sexual violence. This means the tide is churning. This means that more people are listening to survivors. And this opportunity now to remove the statute of limitations recognizes that survivors need the opportunity to go through this process on their own time. Trauma has no timeline. And so it's very, very important that we set up a judicial system that is ready to respond to them. And as was mentioned earlier, we're not losing due process. We're not losing the rights. But what we are gaining here is an opportunity for more justice for survivors. So thank you very much to everyone, to all of the strong leaders who are here, particularly on International Women's Day, for standing up and speaking out on behalf of survivors in our state. And we urge support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And now we'll hear from Kati Akley from the Aurora Center.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about sexual assault, a crime that has silenced too many, but has ignited an international conversation, a conversation that the great state of Minnesota has the courage to engage in. Again, my name is Kati Akley, and I'm the director of the Aurora Center for Advocacy and Education at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And for over 30 years, our nationally recognized center has provided victim services to all genders, as well as offered education around issues of sexual assault, relationship violence, stalking, and sexual harassment. And I'm proud to say that I do get calls from colleagues all over the country who comment and marvel at the amazing strides and leadership that the state of Minnesota has taken in creating equitable, fair, and just laws and policies around criminal misconduct. When I get those calls, I typically answer very humbly, yeah, sure, you betcha. But in all seriousness, one of the reasons I'm here is actually to share the words a survivor once shared with me. She said, being raped is like someone attacking your spirit and killing your soul. And then the world tells you to get up and get living. Working with victim survivors every day, talking with concerned parents and significant others, professors and friends, I know that to simply get up and get living, especially after the trauma of sexual assault, takes far more time than people realize. And it's easier said than done. And that's why ending the statute of limitations for reporting criminal sexual misconduct has such great impact. We know from the research that Dr. Mary Koss or Dr. Christopher Krebs, the National Institute of Justice, or the CDC have conducted that 1 in 5 women experience rape or attempted rape while in college, while 1 in 60 men and 50% of the transgender population experience sexual assault in their lifetime. And unfortunately, only about 12 to 15% of those campus sexual assaults are ever reported to police. Now, I grew up on a farm in small town Minnesota, and I was raised to think about, how do I do good in the world? How do I help people? And it's something that I think about every day. And then I think about a saying that goes, a system is designed to produce exactly what it gets. What if our current system is designed to protect serial perpetrators? One of the things the Me Too movement has revealed to the public is that of the very few people that perpetrate, oftentimes those folks have multiple victims over the course of decades. We've seen the high-profile cases. We've heard the very brave victim survivors who come forward, and yet we know that there are so many more that never make the news. So what if Minnesota had a system designed to encourage reporting and to stop the prolonged crimes? One time in our office, a client came in, and after experiencing a sexual assault over the weekend. And when we sat down, I could see that the person was visibly shaken, upset, and at a loss for words. And we learned that they were acquaintances at a party. No consent was not given. Yes, a forensic exam was conducted, a university report was made, but at the time, a police report was not pursued. I want you to think about this client, this young adult, this student, with a promising future, but perhaps laden with difficulties, with guilt and shame, feelings of isolation, PTSD, triggers and fears. and general distrust. The student's spirit and their soul has been attacked and crushed. And yet, despite it all, I want you to think about that student getting a degree, a job, buying a house or owning a business, contributing to society, maybe even having a family, being a mom or a dad. And so all of a sudden, this client that had walked through our doors, all of a sudden in the future, he's a father. I want you to think about him learning years later in his life that his perpetrator has done it again, has sexually assaulted someone, and that all the memories that have been locked away and hidden come rushing back at him and hit him like a hammer as if it were yesterday. But maybe now that he's in a different place in his life, in his healing, maybe now he has the courage enough to speak up and to put shame aside and to do something when before he was too scared, too confused, and too worried. Maybe now people would believe him if he broke his silence. And maybe now, just like so many other victim survivors who are women and men and beyond the gender binary, he could do something that could make it right, to do good, and to help others. Maybe now Minnesota can lead the nation and show how serious sexual assault really is and end the statute of limitations on reporting criminal sexual misconduct. Maybe then victim survivors could actually get up and get living. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. And now we'll hear from Jeff Anderson, who's an attorney here in Minnesota.
It's time. It is time to allow the survivors and the victims of rape and assault to come forward when they are ready and when they are able, and to remove the criminal statute of limitations that has prevented so many survivors from exposing their offenders and the offenders that are still in this community. My name is Jeff Anderson. I've been working with and receiving calls from survivors of sexual assault and abuse for over 3 decades. A day doesn't go by in our office in which we haven't received a call from a survivor who has suffered in silence, fear, confusion, or shame, and shares the secret with us, sometimes for the first time, and who we then have to work with and tell that this must be reported. But when it is, nothing can be done to expose that offender in the criminal system and prosecute that offender because of the statute of limitations. The time had passed. The time was up for justice. This is the time that is now up for exposing those offenders that still exist in our communities. The statute of limitations and the criminal statute of limitations protects the wrong class of folks. It protects those offenders. It doesn't protect our children and those that have been harmed by those offenders. It's time for Minnesota to remove the criminal statute of limitations and allow the survivors of rape, abuse, and crimes of violence to come forward and expose those offenders when the survivor is ready, and not when somebody else says they should. Thank you.
And now we've been joined by Representative Dave Pinto, who will also share some remarks.
Hello, I'm Representative Dave Pinto, P-I-N-T-O, from St. Paul. Outside the legislature, I work as a prosecutor of gender violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence. And these cases, and cases of sexual violence in particular, involve some really different dynamics than so many other cases. It can take quite a while for someone who's experienced the trauma of sexual violence to be in a position to participate in what can be a really, really difficult prosecution. It is so important that we do everything that we can as a state and as a community to lift up those who've experienced sexual assault, to give them every opportunity to come forward, and then certainly to be holding accountable the people who've done this to them. And I just want to say thank you so much to the people standing up here with me on behalf of, as I know that they are, on behalf of so many across the state who've experienced this trauma, and to make sure that we all are standing strong with them, making sure to hold accountable those who've done this to them. So thank you so much, Representative Omar, and to everyone who's put this together. Thank you. Thanks.
So today you've heard from survivors, victims. You've heard from advocates. You've heard from prosecutors. You've heard from defense attorneys. You've heard from lawmakers on why this is very necessary measure for us to take in order to give survivor victims their choice back. Oftentimes, as you've heard today, this particular crime and these survivors and victims are criminalized, brutalized, attacked, and silenced. And the last thing we want to do is to advance a criminal justice system that continues to silence and re-victimize them. And so I ask my colleagues to help us push this bill through. As I said earlier, this is a nonpartisan bill. We have over a dozen legislators co-authoring it, Republicans and Democrats, and it's very exciting to see all of us come together in recognizing that it is definitely time. And maybe we have 7 minutes for questions if anyone has.
The present statute of limitations is kind of complicated, but it's 6 to 9 years depending upon when the crime occurred. But the bottom line is that it doesn't give enough time, and the time limit is too short, and as a result, we know there are thousands, literally thousands of offenders out there yet to be exposed and or prosecuted because the time limit is too short.
How hard is it to get a statute of limitations? I mean, is it a typical process, what you're asking for? Like, what are is it just a legislative yes or
no? We sometimes could make things that are not complicated very complicated here, but this is very simple. I think all of us are elected to do the people's job, and these are the people. They're asking us to remove this limitation, and I think we can get this done.
What other crimes right now have an indefinite period for prosecution?
The other question is, what other crimes have no statute of limitations? And the question is, what other crimes have no statute of limitations besides? And the only crime right now in Minnesota that has no statute of limitations is homicide, murder. And the reason there is no statute of limitations in murder is because the murderer is uniquely suited to conceal oftentimes the evidence of that crime. So it is in rape and childhood sexual abuse, because it is the offender that can overwhelm with power, coercion, fear, confusion, and shame the survivor, so he or she cannot cope, cannot report, and cannot act. So in statute of limitations terms, the public policy behind removal in murder is the same as it is here. Thus, it should be. And the question was asked, is it hard to remove the statute of limitations? Oftentimes in the past, it was and it has been. Can't be today, because the only ones that can speak against this issue are those offenders who are in the corners and in the places where they can access vulnerable adults and children.
Is there a reason the bill can't be retroactive to include prior offenses going back?
The question is there a reason it can't be retroactive? And unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision on a California bill just like this, ruled that there's a legal principle called ex post facto on criminal cases. You can't do a look back. So you can only look forward. And as a result, this is a looking forward bill. So most of the adults and children protected by this bill will be our children. But that's a really good reason, too. So unfortunately, there can't be a look back, and it can't be retroactive.
Question to the authors, Representative Omar and Senator Pappas. Forgive us, we were a little late to the party. If I may ask you to take a step backwards to what I anticipate you talked about at the beginning, about the momentum that brought you to this moment now where you feel that the time is right to introduce this kind of legislation.
Well, I think that in my comments I talked about how the kind of sexual harassment that all women have experienced, and often some men, and certainly transgender and gay people and lesbians have experienced. And it, as Jeff just said, Mr. Anderson just said, that this is often a crime that's a very hidden crime, and that victims are so traumatized by the crime that they don't feel like they can talk about it or reveal it. It takes years of therapy, years of introspection, and they relive it constantly. And I think it takes a lot of courage to step forward and admit that you were that vulnerable, you were that tricked, you were that manipulated when you thought as a child that it was probably your fault. So I think it is, obviously the Me Too movement has been part of this, but it's been growing as more and more people have stepped forward to admit, as a previous witness did, that they were a victim, and that is okay. It's not your fault. You need to come forward, and your perpetrator needs to be brought to justice, and you need to be able to step up and see that happen.
I mean, I think the breaking of the silence has become a pretty normalized thing. I think in society today, and we think that it is time for something like this to be able to move forward in the legislature. I think the advocates that brought the bill to us, and myself and Senator Pappas, think it is actually timely for us to have this discussion. And I don't think a year ago we would be able to get as many people signing on to a bill like this as we have today. And so it's right. I think our society is ripe for change.
This bill was just brought to me yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to talk to the committee chair. But I think it's just a matter of time, and we just have to convince the chairs that this should be a priority.
So this is being officially introduced today, it'll be part of today's introduction?
Is your bill up the end?
Yes, it's being introduced today, and we're hoping to get those commitments from the chairs. We certainly have a lot of support from people who sit on those committees as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.